Hello, and welcome to myfinanceteacher.org. Let's talk about the alternative harvest today, looking at MJ. It's one of the interesting ETFs that I really like to follow, as I think in the longer term, perhaps over the next couple of years, the long-term potential in MJ, the long-term potential in cannabis is really promising. And of course, the main reason for that is that it's likely going to be decriminalized in Congress, perhaps over the next years, if not, maybe over the next several months. So let's have a look at that fundamental factor. The MORE Act, the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act, has actually recently passed House. That was in December last year. And it's perhaps going to be discussed in the Senate sometime this year. And the interesting thing about this is a lot of organizations, such as Amazon, such as Human Rights Watch, as you see in front of you, do actually support this decriminalization of marijuana. They do urge Congress to support this MORE Act. Looking at history back in 2019, there was a previous attempt of this MORE Act which actually failed, and what we saw is that in expectation of this decriminalization, there was a significant bump in this MJ ETF, measuring from say late 2018 into early 2019, gives us a return of around 70% gain, which is, well, that's pretty nice. What happened after that, during 2019, is that this MORE Act did not pass last time. And of course, all of that air, all of that money came out of this industry, came out of alternative harvest, came out of cannabis, and MJ dropped far below this 50-week moving average. This is a weekly chart that we're looking at. At this bottom that's in early 2020, actually most things dropped in March 2020, of course, with the pandemic. In either case, at this bottom, MJ was around 63% below its 50-week moving average, which was pretty oversold looking at this 14-week RSI. So that's more or less a longer-term RSI. It was really deep into oversold. So a bounce was to be expected, which actually took place into mid-2020, giving a pretty good return of nearly 70%. But what happened in late 2020, in December 2020, the second attempt at the MORE Act actually passed House, the lower chambers of the Congress, which, as you see, created an explosive move up in MJ, which, measuring just from this December low to this short-term top, was a gain of nearly 144%. So that, of course, is also quite overbought, and we see that 14-week RSI was deep into overbought area at the level of 79.5. And of course, you perhaps don't really want to enter when the long-term RSI is nearly at 80 and the stretch above the 50-week moving average is at about 140%. But luckily, since then, the risks, I think, have diminished significantly, where MJ has declined back towards that 50-week moving average. And while nobody knows the future, you have to understand this, we're just looking at probabilities and trying to position the portfolio according to what's likely to happen. And the likely scenario here is that since MJ has already been far below the 50-week moving average back in early to mid 2020, which is relatively recent history, I think it's a little too early for MJ to drop again far below the 50-week moving average. Perhaps after a strong bounce into the first half of 2021, MJ wants to cool down to retest the support somewhere close to that 50-week moving average before deciding if it's going to give us one more bounce. And if we see any positive news from Congress over the next, say, a few months, that would create a very attractive bounce. Now, zooming into the daily chart, as you know, I do like to look at cycles because they reflect market sentiments, and I think as humans it's hard for us to escape our emotions, which actually fuels these cyclical fluctuations in the markets. Although the cycles are hard to predict precisely, there is some periodic movement up and down. And looking at MJ's history going back to early 2018, it seems that on average the cycles last for about 3 months. And zooming in on what has been going on since March this year, it seems to me that MJ is in a new cycle since mid-May. Although contrary to this expectation, of course it's also possible that MJ is still continuing within that cycle starting in early March. Perhaps MJ wants to retest this 200-day moving average before moving into the rallying stage of the next cycle. I would give this scenario, say perhaps a 35% chance. And the reasons why I don't really think that this scenario is extremely likely is firstly because of the cycle length. If that is the case, the cycle is going to stretch for, well, let's say 3.5, nearly 4 months. And over the last 3 years, it's only been 3 times when the cycles lasted for over 100 days. So it is possible, but it's not extremely likely. Another reason why I think MJ is in a new cycle starting from mid-May is that this bounce we've seen since then is quite convincing. RSI has moved up from as low as 34.6 to as high as 59.7. Now, given that we're in a new cycle, what are the possible continuations of the ongoing cycle? Well, if Congress doesn't consider the MORE Act favorably, then the rest of the cycle, which usually lasts for 3 months, so that's perhaps for another couple of months, we're going to see really difficult times on MJ, very significant losses. This, I think, is not extremely likely. I would possibly give it 5 to 10% chance, which leaves me with the third scenario, which in my opinion is most likely, with my subjective probability of 55 to 60% chance. And that scenario is a consolidation in MJ over the next few days. Yesterday we saw Hexo reporting quite significant losses, and as the markets digest some of these losses that alternative harvest producers might have, perhaps MJ will be relatively soft for, let's say, a week or so. That will also allow the 200-day moving average to climb a little bit closer to the current MJ prices, which will also be a good sign in my opinion, as the stretch above the 200-day moving average is one of the signs of a market being a little bit overbought. And after a bit of a consolidation, I think it's likely that the MJ cycle is going to continue higher, as the cycle is only about a month old, and we perhaps have another few weeks of an upward momentum in the ongoing cycle before it possibly has to turn down simply based on the average duration of these cycles. Next, let's have a look at the Optimism index in MJ, which is important for considering these market cycles. So as we see, Optimism is quite volatile, jumping from the green line at the bottom to the red line at the top, all within simply a couple of days. So what I have is a solid green line, which is the 10-day moving average of this Optimism index on MJ. And looking at history, it seems that MJ likes to bottom when this 10-day moving average is somewhere below the level of 30 or so, with the exception of March 2020, when the 10-day Optimism index dropped to around the level of 10. But then, of course, everything dropped really hard in May 2020. So another repeat of such low levels is not extremely likely. Hence, looking at the most recent low, we see that the 10-day moving average of this Optimism index came to around that level, around 30 or slightly below that, and an impressive bounce since then tells me that MJ is in a new cycle, which perhaps is experiencing some sort of a consolidation at the moment. So what happened to us in the ongoing cycle is that back in May we got a position in MJ, but unfortunately at the moment that position was stopped out as MJ dropped below the support level from the 50-day and the 20-day moving averages, the blue line and the red line. So over the next few days, what I'm going to do with the members at myfinancesteacher.org is to observe MJ, see how far it drops, and wait for a green candle before I consider if it's a good idea to try to re-enter. And of course, while we are looking at a series of red candles, it's perhaps a little bit dangerous to enter right now, as there is a risk of just catching a falling knife and hurting yourself. But again, to reiterate, in the longer term, I really do want to have a position in MJ as the long-term potential, in my opinion, is significant. If there is a good news from Congress, perhaps over the next few months, even just retesting these 2019 highs at around a round number of 40 gives you nearly double of the current price levels. So perhaps we're gonna keep an eye on this one. And that is all from me for now, but back to you now. Let me know what you think about decriminalization of cannabis and how likely is it sometime in 2021. And of course, while you're at it in the comments section, remember to hit that like button and share the video with your friends and subscribe to the channel. I wish you a pleasant day and good luck in your trades.